The day was cold but bright. The wind carried a soft chill that hinted at rain later in the afternoon. A teenage girl walked down the sidewalk, holding a small paper bag from the pharmacy close to her chest. Her arm rested in a white sling, the faint blue of her jacket sleeve tucked neatly underneath. Every few steps she adjusted her bag gently, careful not to bump her arm against her body. She had just come from the clinic. The doctor had said her arm would take a few more weeks to heal. It wasn't broken badly, but it still hurt when she moved it too quickly. She didn't complain, though. She was the kind of person who tried not to cause trouble for anyone. Her school backpack was slung over her good shoulder. She had missed a few days of class because of her injury, and she was hoping to return the next morning. She looked forward to seeing her friends again. For now, she just wanted to get home before the weather turned. Across the street, parked near the curb, a police car idled quietly. Inside, a middle-aged officer watched the road through his windshield. He had been on the force for years, long enough to think he could read people at a glance. His shift had been quiet so far, and sometimes quiet made him restless. When he saw the girl crossing the intersection a few feet away, he noticed her pause at the corner. She looked at the traffic light, waited for it to turn green, and then slowly crossed. Something about the way she moved caught his eye. Her hesitance, the way she held her arm. To him, it didn't look like pain. It looked like she was trying to hide something. He frowned, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. "What's she up to?" he muttered to himself. He convinced himself he was just doing his job, keeping an eye out for suspicious behavior. The following days brought a strange stillness over the town. It wasn't quiet because nothing was happening. It was quiet because everyone was watching, waiting, listening. People who usually never paid attention to local news were now glued to their phones, reading updates, scrolling through comments, and trying to understand how something like this could happen right in their own community. The police station was surrounded by reporters now. Cameras flashed as officers came and went, some keeping their heads down, others pretending not to notice. The chief of police avoided interviews. He knew that one wrong word could make the situation even worse. A few months after the girl's mural became a small-town landmark, the energy around town began to shift in a new way. It wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about progress. People weren't talking about what had happened as a wound, but as a lesson, one that had taught everyone how fragile justice could be, and how strong kindness was when it was put into action. The mayor had been busy. His office had launched a new program called Voices of Change. It brought together young people and police officers once a month to talk about respect, understanding, and empathy. The girl and her grandmother were invited as special guests at the first meeting. The room was filled with nervous faces, students on one side, officers on the other. No one really knew what to say at first. The air felt thick with unspoken tension, but then the girl stood up quietly. She didn't give a speech or read notes. She just looked around and said, "I think everyone here wants the same thing, to feel safe and respected. I think we just forget that sometimes." Her words broke the silence like sunlight breaking through clouds. Heads began to nod. Slowly, people started sharing small stories, moments of misunderstanding, moments of kindness that were overlooked, times they had judged too quickly. By the end of the meeting, people were talking freely. Some even laughed. The mayor stood at the back, smiling. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and that was enough. After the meeting, the girl's grandmother hugged her tightly. "You did good," she whispered. The girl smiled. "I didn't really do anything." "Yes, you did," her grandmother said. "You reminded people to see each other again." That night, the mayor sat in his office writing a letter to the town council. He wanted to make the program permanent. Real change, he wrote, is not a single act. It is a habit, a daily choice to do better. At home, the girl returned to her normal life. School felt easier now, lighter. Teachers who used to just nod at her in the hall now stopped to ask how she was doing. Some of her classmates even started calling her our brave girl. She didn't love the nickname, it made her blush. But deep down, she was proud of what it meant. One afternoon after school, she stopped by the police station with her grandmother. They weren't there for a complaint this time. They were invited. The department had created a small community room with a mural on the wall that looked familiar. It was her design, the same one she had painted on her grandmother's fence. An officer smiled and said, We thought it should be here too as a reminder of what we're trying to build. The girl looked at it quietly for a moment. The same hands of all colors holding together around a heart. She nodded. Thank you, she said softly. Her grandmother took her hand and squeezed it. For the first time in a long while, the police station didn't feel like a place of fear. It felt like a place of change. Across town, the former officer, the one who had been suspended, was rebuilding his life, one small day at a time. He had finished the community service program he started months ago, but he didn't stop volunteering. He kept helping at the shelter, mentoring at-risk youth, and even assisting the Voices of Change program. Though at first, no one knew it was him. When the mayor found out, he didn't stop him. Instead, he called him into his office one afternoon. You've been showing up every week, the mayor said. No cameras, no speeches. Just work, why? The officer looked down for a moment. Because it's what I should have done a long time ago, he said quietly. I spent years thinking authority meant control. Now I know it's about service. The mayor nodded slowly. I can't undo the past, he said. But I can make sure the future is different. Keep going. This town needs people willing to do the work. That conversation stayed with the officer. It didn't erase what had happened, but it gave him a purpose again. A few weeks later, the Voices of Change program held its second meeting. This time more people showed up. Parents, teachers, and community members. The girl stood at the front with the mayor and spoke briefly about what had changed since the first meeting. Halfway through the session, the former officer entered quietly and took a seat at the back. When it came time for open discussion, he stood up slowly and said, I used to think my badge made me right. But I learned that being right and being good are not the same thing. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I can promise to do better. The room fell silent. But it wasn't a silence of anger. It was one of understanding. The girl looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, Thank you for saying that. That simple exchange, that moment of shared humanity, became the heart of the evening. Afterward, when the meeting ended, the officer approached the grandmother and the girl. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply said, I'm sorry. The grandmother looked him in the eyes and said, Change is a choice. I hope you keep choosing it. The officer nodded. I will. That night as they drove home, the girl sat quietly looking out the window. The world outside looked calm, streetlights glowing, neighbors chatting, kids playing. Do you think people can really change? She asked again, her voice soft. Her grandmother smiled. You've seen it happen, haven't you? The girl nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess I have. In the following months, the town's story reached more people. A small film crew visited to document how a single incident had transformed a community. The mayor, the girl, her grandmother, and even the officer were interviewed. The documentary wasn't about blame. It was about healing, understanding, and growth. When it premiered at the community center, the room was filled with emotion. People laughed, cried, and hugged each other. When the final scene showed the mural, the same one on the fence, the whole audience stood and applauded. After the screening, the mayor spoke softly to the crowd. This story isn't about what happened, he said. It's about what came after. It's proof that compassion is stronger than anger. From that day on, the town became known for more than the mistake that had once divided it. It became known for its unity, a small place with a big heart, where people learned that real change comes from understanding, not punishment. The girl continued speaking at youth programs, sometimes nervously but always with honesty. Her grandmother became a quiet mentor to parents and teachers. The mayor expanded Voices of Change to nearby towns, and the former officer dedicated his time to training recruits, not in tactics but in empathy. Years later, the girl would look back on that chapter of her life and realize that pain had led her to purpose. She had learned something that most people take a lifetime to understand, that even in the darkest moments, there's light if you keep your heart open. She would never forget what happened, but she no longer carried it as a wound. It became a reminder of strength, forgiveness, and the power of being seen. One summer evening, she walked by her old mural again. It was a little faded now, but still beautiful. A group of younger kids were painting next to it, adding new colors, new shapes, new hope. She stopped and smiled. One of the kids turned to her and said, "Did you paint this?" She nodded. "A long time ago. It's really nice, the child said. We're just adding to it. She laughed softly. That's how it should be. As she walked away, the sound of laughter and paintbrushes filled the air. The sunset painted the sky in soft gold and pink. And for the first time in a long while, everything felt whole. Some stories end in pain, she thought. But the best ones end in peace. And in that quiet moment, the town that once broke apart stood together, not perfect, not fixed, but human. That was enough. Inside the mayor's office, the air was tense. He had been up most of the night reading through emails and letters from citizens, some filled with anger, some with disappointment, and some simply asking, "What are you going to do about it?" A week had passed since the meeting at City Hall, but the echoes of that night still lingered in everyone's hearts. The girl had returned to school, though things felt different. Some students whispered, some stared, some came up to her quietly to say they were proud of her. She didn't like the attention, but she understood why it was happening. People weren't just looking at her as the girl from the news anymore. They were seeing her as someone who had stood up for herself when it was hardest to do so. Her grandmother walked her to school that morning. The air was cool and smell. The days after the town event felt different, lighter somehow. The air wasn't filled with whispers or anger anymore. It was filled with quiet conversations about change. People who used to look away from each other on the street now nodded and said hello. Neighbors who had never talked before began sharing stories. The small town, once divided by silence and fear, was slowly finding its voice again. The girl's story had reached far beyond the town. A few newspapers picked it up, not in a sensational way, but in a hopeful one. They called it a small town's lesson in courage and change. The girl didn't think of herself as brave. She just felt like someone who had told the truth and hoped someone would listen. But now people were writing letters to her school, thanking her for having the courage to speak up. At first, all that attention made her nervous. She didn't want to be famous. She just wanted to be normal again. Go to school, laugh with her friends, and not have everyone looking at her differently. But slowly she realized that what she had done wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had ever felt unseen. Her grandmother could see the change in her. "You stand taller now," she said one morning as they sat together at the kitchen table. The girl smiled shyly. "I think I just learned that being quiet doesn't always help." The grandmother chuckled softly. "No, it doesn't," she said. "Sometimes silence is the loudest mistake." Meanwhile, the mayor had been keeping his promise. He didn't let the story fade away once the cameras were gone. He set up regular meetings between community leaders and the police department. They didn't always go smoothly. Some were tense, some emotional, but they were real. For the first time, people were talking to each other instead of about each other. The mayor often thought about the girl and her grandmother. He had seen many cases, many complaints in his time, but something about this one had touched him personally. Maybe because he saw it happen. Maybe because it reminded him of his own daughter, who was about the same age. Whatever the reason, he knew it had changed him. He had started spending more time out in the community, visiting schools, attending neighborhood events, sitting in church services. He wanted people to see him not just as the mayor behind a desk, but as someone who cared enough to listen. One sunny afternoon, the girl's grandmother received a call from his office. They wanted to invite the girl to speak at the local youth center. It wasn't about the incident, it was about courage, kindness, and using your voice. The girl hesitated at first, but her grandmother encouraged her. "You don't have to make it perfect," she said. "Just make it honest." When the day came, the youth center was full. Kids from different schools, teachers, and a few local reporters were there. The girl walked up to the small stage, her arm now healed but still in a soft brace. She looked nervous, but when she saw her grandmother smiling from the front row, she took a deep breath and began. "I used to think that if you kept quiet, bad things would just go away," she said softly. "But they don't, they just grow. And the longer you stay quiet, the heavier it gets." That day I didn't plan to say anything. I was scared. But then I realized, if I didn't speak, someone else might get hurt. So I spoke up. The room was completely silent. Even the youngest kids were listening. She continued, "I'm not brave every day. I still get scared sometimes. But I learned that you don't have to be fearless to tell the truth. You just have to care enough to do it anyway." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. The mayor stood at the back watching proudly. He didn't see a victim anymore. He saw a young leader. After the event, he walked up to her and said, "You know, you've done more for this town than most adults ever could." She smiled a little and said, "I just told my story." "That's how change always starts," he said. With one honest story, the next few weeks brought even more changes. The police department introduced new training programs focused on empathy and communication. Officers spent time volunteering at schools and youth centers, not to gain approval but to build understanding. The suspended officer, the one who had caused all of this, had also started a new chapter. He was still off duty, but he was volunteering at a local shelter. At first, people didn't know how to react to him. Some ignored him, others questioned his sincerity, but he kept showing up, quietly, without asking for anything. One afternoon, the mayor stopped by the shelter. He saw the officer handing out food and talking with some of the volunteers. When he noticed the mayor, he froze for a second, unsure what to say. The mayor walked over and said, "You're doing good work." The officer looked down. "I'm trying," he said softly. "I can't change what I did, but I can change what I do now." The mayor nodded. "That's all any of us can do." Later that week, the officer wrote another letter, this one addressed to the mayor and the police department. He didn't ask for his job back. Instead, he wrote about what he had learned, about empathy, and about seeing people as human beings before anything else. The chief read it during a staff meeting, and it left the room quiet for a long time. Back at the girl's home, things had begun to feel normal again. She went to school, did her homework, laughed with her friends, and even started painting again, something she had stopped doing for months. One afternoon, she painted a mural on her grandmother's fence. It showed hands of all colors holding together around a small heart. When the mayor heard about it, he came to see it in person. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. The girl smiled. "It's what I hope people see when they think about our town." The grandmother nodded proudly. "It's what we all hope for." Over time, the mural became a small landmark. People would walk by and stop to look at it. Some even left flowers or notes beside it, thanking the girl for reminding them what compassion looked like. Months passed. The story that once divided the town now connected it. Schools started programs where students and police worked together on community projects. The mayor's office received messages from nearby towns asking for advice on how to start similar initiatives. One evening, as the sun was setting, the girl and her grandmother sat on their porch again, watching the sky turn gold. The air was warm and quiet, filled with the sound of crickets and laughter from the street. The girl leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder. "Do you think people really change?" she asked softly. Her grandmother smiled and said, "I think people can surprise you when they're given a chance to do better." The girl thought about that for a long moment, then nodded. "I think they can too." Across town, the mayor stood at his window again, looking out at the same evening light. He thought about how one small act, one moment of truth, had reshaped an entire community. It reminded him that leadership wasn't about power or titles. It was about doing the right thing when it mattered most. And somewhere in a quiet apartment, the former officer sat by his window, holding a photo of his own family. He had made mistakes, but he was learning, slowly, honestly. He had started mentoring young recruits about empathy and responsibility. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning. In the end, the town wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was better. People had learned to listen. They had learned to see one another not as strangers, but as neighbors. And the girl who once felt powerless had become a symbol of courage and change, not because she wanted to be, but because she believed in truth. As the night grew darker, the girl looked up at the stars and whispered quietly, "Thank you." Maybe she was thanking her grandmother. Maybe she was thanking the universe. Or maybe she was thanking herself for not staying silent, for believing that even the smallest voice can echo loud enough to change the world. And in that quiet moment, under the gentle light of the stars, the story that began with pain finally ended with hope. "Ed like rain, you know," her grandmother said softly. "When I was your age, we didn't have anyone to speak up for us. I'm proud that you didn't stay quiet." The girl smiled shyly and nodded. "I just didn't want anyone else to get hurt," she said. Meanwhile, across town, the mayor sat in his office reading a new report. The investigation into the incident was almost complete. It had revealed gaps in training, communication, and empathy inside the police department. The mayor felt both angry and hopeful. Angry that things had gone wrong for so long, but hopeful that now, finally, the cracks were visible enough to fix. He had been meeting with community leaders every day, listening more than speaking. A local pastor had told him, "You can pass all the policies you want, but people need to see change in hearts, not just papers." That line stuck with him. At the police station, the chief was preparing to hold a staff meeting. It wasn't going to be easy. Some officers were defensive, others quiet, but it had to be done. The department couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. The chief stood before them and said, "We wear badges to protect, not to harm. But that means protecting everyone, no matter who they are. If we can't do that, then we've forgotten what this job really means." The room was still. Even the officer who had caused the incident sat silently in the back, his eyes lowered. He hadn't spoken much since his suspension. He came that day only to listen. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind. He waited until everyone left, then walked up to the chief. His voice was low and shaky. "Sir, I want to make things right. I don't know how yet, but I can't just walk away like nothing happened." The chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's a start," he said. "But making things right isn't about words. It's about how you live after this." Later that afternoon, the girl and her grandmother received an invitation. The mayor wanted them to attend a new community event the city was planning. It was called One Town, One Voice. The goal was to bring people together, police, teachers, families, to talk openly about what needed to change. The grandmother hesitated at first. She wasn't sure if they were ready for something like that. But the girl wanted to go. "If we want people to listen," she said, "we have to show up." On the day of the event, the town square was filled with people. There were tents, chairs, and a small stage set up near the fountain. Music played softly from speakers. The atmosphere was calm but expectant. You could tell people wanted something good to come out of this. The mayor walked around, shaking hands, talking with residents. The chief stood nearby, listening quietly. A few reporters were there too, though the mayor had asked them to keep things respectful. This wasn't about headlines. When it was time to speak, the mayor stepped up to the microphone. He didn't have a script. He looked at the crowd and said, "This town has been through a lot these past few weeks. We've seen the worst of our mistakes and the best of our courage, and today I just want to say thank you to those who didn't stay silent, to those who are ready to change, and to those who still believe we can do better." The crowd clapped softly. The mayor then turned toward the girl and her grandmother, who sat in the front row. "You both reminded us what justice looks like," he said. "It's not anger. It's truth told with courage." The girl felt her throat tighten. She didn't like being in the spotlight, but she understood why she was there. Then something unexpected happened. The suspended officer walked into the square. Some people noticed right away. A few gasped quietly, others whispered. The mayor saw him too, but didn't stop him. He wanted to see what would happen. The officer didn't go to the front or try to make a speech. He stood near the back, holding something in his hands. A folded letter. After a moment, he walked slowly toward the girl and her grandmother. The crowd grew quiet. He stopped a few feet away and spoke softly. "I know there's nothing I can say that erases what I did," he began. "But I've been thinking every day since that moment. About how I saw you not as a person, but as something less, and that's wrong. You didn't deserve that. Nobody does." He took a shaky breath and continued. "I wrote this, not for the news, not for my job, but because I needed to say it. I'm sorry." He placed the folded letter on the table in front of them and stepped back. The girl didn't speak. She looked at her grandmother, who nodded gently. Then the girl said quietly, "Thank you for saying it." The officer nodded and walked away without looking back. The mayor watched all of it unfold and felt a quiet sense of something healing, even if just a little. He turned to the crowd and said, "This is what accountability looks like. Not perfection, just the courage to face the truth." The rest of the day was filled with honest conversations. People talked about fear, misunderstanding, and hope. Officers sat with families. Kids painted murals about unity. It wasn't a perfect day, but it was a beginning. A day when everyone remembered they were part of one community. As the sun began to set, the girl walked by the fountain. The mayor joined her, his jacket draped over his arm. You did something powerful today, he said softly. She looked at him and smiled faintly. I just told the truth, she said. He nodded. That's the most powerful thing any of us can do. Later that evening, the mayor went home and turned on the local news. For once, the headlines weren't angry. The top story showed children painting the mural, with a caption that read, "Community finds hope after pain." He leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to peace. Meanwhile, the officer sat at his kitchen table again. The badge he once wore lay beside him. He knew he might never wear it again, but maybe that was how it was supposed to be. He picked up a small notebook and began writing, not about what had happened, but about what he wanted to learn from it. He wrote, "If I ever wear that badge again, I want to earn it the right way." Across town, the girl and her grandmother sat on the porch, the evening breeze brushing against their faces. Fireflies flickered in the yard. The grandmother looked at her and said, "You know, I think people are finally seeing us. Really seeing us." The girl smiled softly. "Yeah," she said. "It feels different now." The stars above glimmered quietly. It wasn't the end of their story, not yet, but it was a moment where hope felt possible again, where forgiveness, understanding, and change had begun to find their way into the cracks of a once broken town. The mayor leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had been in public service long enough to know that one moment could change everything. A single choice, a single action, could define how people saw an entire system. He rubbed his forehead and sighed. "This isn't just about one officer," he said quietly to himself. "This is about trust." Meanwhile, in a small house on the east side of town, the girl sat by the window, her sling resting on her lap. Her grandmother had gone to the store, and for the first time in days, the girl was alone. She watched the street outside, kids riding bikes, a delivery truck passing, a neighbor watering his plants. Life was still moving, even though hers felt like it had stopped. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her teacher. It said, "Everyone at school is thinking of you. Don't let this break you. You're stronger than you think." She smiled faintly, though her eyes were tired. She wanted to believe that she was strong, that she could turn this into something meaningful. But she also felt scared, not just of what had happened, but of all the attention. People she didn't even know were now talking about her online. Some defended her, others doubted her story. It hurt reading those words. She turned off her phone and took a deep breath. A knock came at the door. She hesitated for a second, then got up slowly and opened it. Standing there was a woman in a simple blazer holding a notebook. She introduced herself as an investigator working under the mayor's office. "I'm not here to bother you," the woman said gently. "I just need to ask a few questions about what happened so we can make sure everything is done fairly." The girl nodded and let her in. They sat at the kitchen table. The woman spoke softly, asking about the time, the place, what was said, and how she felt. The girl answered carefully, her voice trembling at times. When she was done, the woman closed her notebook and said quietly, "You did the right thing by speaking up." After she left, the girl felt lighter somehow. Not completely okay, but a little more in control. She poured herself a glass of water and sat back down by the window. At that same moment, the suspended officer sat alone in his apartment. The blinds were closed, the TV was on low volume, and a half-empty cup of coffee sat beside him. His phone kept ringing, but he didn't answer. He had seen his name on the news, heard people calling for his firing, seen neighbors avoid his eyes when he went outside. He wasn't used to feeling powerless. For years, he thought he understood what justice meant. He thought being tough meant being respected. But now, sitting there with no badge, no uniform, and no one defending him, he realized how quickly things could fall apart. He thought about calling his captain, but what could he say? "I messed up?" The word sounded empty, even in his own mind. A soft knock on his door startled him. It was his mother, a quiet woman with gentle eyes. She looked at him for a long moment before saying anything. "I saw the news," she whispered. "I raised you better than this." He looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to go that way," he muttered. "I didn't mean—" She stopped him. "It doesn't matter what you meant," she said softly. "What matters is what you did, and now what you do next." Her words stayed with him long after she left. For the first time in years, he started to question himself. Not just his actions, but the kind of man he had become. Back at City Hall, The mayor was preparing for a community meeting. He had called it to listen, not to defend or lecture, but to truly hear what people had to say. The room filled quickly. Citizens, church leaders, teachers, young people, and they all came. Some were angry, some nervous, some hopeful. When the mayor walked in, everyone turned to look at him. He stood at the podium for a moment, letting the room quiet down. Then he said, "I saw what happened. I wish I hadn't, but I did. And I want you all to know I won't let it be ignored. This is not who we should be." A man in the crowd spoke up. "We've heard promises before. What makes this time different?" The mayor looked him straight in the eyes. "Because this time it happened in front of me. And I will not forget what I saw." There was a pause, and then someone began to clap. Slowly, others joined in. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. A quiet show of belief that maybe, just maybe, things could change. After the meeting, the mayor walked out into the cool evening air. The sun was setting behind the buildings, painting the sky in soft orange light. He stood there for a while, thinking about how fragile leadership could be. You couldn't fix everything, but you could start with one truth, one act of honesty. Meanwhile, at the girl's home, her grandmother was preparing dinner when the phone rang. It was the mayor's office again. They wanted to invite them both to meet a group working on new community safety reforms. The grandmother hesitated, unsure if she wanted to bring her granddaughter back into the spotlight, but the girl spoke up quietly. "Maybe it's time," she said. Later that week, they went to the city hall again. The same investigator from before greeted them with a warm smile. Inside, there were people from all backgrounds, teachers, parents, even a few young officers. The room felt different this time. It wasn't about blame. It was about building something better. The mayor looked at the girl and her grandmother as they entered. He nodded respectfully. When it was her turn to speak, the girl stood up slowly. Her voice was soft but steady. "I used to think nobody would listen to someone like me," she said. "But now I see that sometimes, even when you're scared, telling the truth can make people open their eyes. I just hope that next time something like this happens, someone will step in before it gets that far." The room was silent for a moment. Then the mayor spoke, his voice calm but emotional. "You've already done more than most people ever do," he said. "You made us see what we needed to see." After the meeting, the girl and her grandmother walked out into the night. The stars were faint but clear. The girl looked up and said softly, "I think things might really change." Her grandmother smiled. "They already are," she said. At that same hour, the officer sat at his table again. He had spent the last few days writing an apology, not for the cameras, not for the press, but for himself. He didn't know if anyone would read it, but he needed to say it anyway. He wanted to face what he had done. He folded the letter and looked out the window, thinking about how a single mistake had opened his eyes. He couldn't undo it, but maybe he could start to be better. Across town, the mayor stood by his office window, watching the streetlights flicker on. He thought of the girl, her grandmother, and the courage it took for them to stand tall. He whispered quietly to himself, "This is how change begins, with one truth that refuses to be hidden." The girl reached the end of the street and turned toward the small grocery store near the bus stop. She didn't notice the police car behind her until the siren chirped once, not loud, just enough to startle her. She turned quickly, her good hand clutching the strap of her bag. The officer rolled down his window and waved for her to stop. She froze, unsure. "Me?" she asked quietly. "Yeah, you," he said, stepping out of the car. His tone wasn't shouting, but it wasn't kind either. The girl hesitated, her heart beating fast. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just walking home. Still, she stopped because that's what she had been taught to do. The officer walked closer. "Where are you coming from?" he asked sharply. "From the clinic, sir," she replied softly. She lifted her sling slightly, as if that would explain everything. He narrowed his eyes. "Clinic? What for?" "My arm," she said. "It's broken." He studied her for a moment, his face expressionless. "You got ID on you?" She nodded, trying to reach for her pocket with her good hand. The motion was awkward, and she struggled to pull the small wallet free. The strap of her bag got tangled, and she winced as her sling shifted. The officer's patience thinned. "Hurry up," he said, his tone growing sharper. "I'm trying," she whispered. "It's just my arm." The next morning started quietly in the small town. The streets looked calm, but the air carried a strange tension. The story of what happened at the traffic stop the day before had begun to spread, though not everyone knew the full truth yet. People whispered, passing glances at the police station and at the coffee shop nearby. Inside her small apartment, the young girl from the day before sat on the edge of her bed, her arm still in a sling. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of anger on the officer's face, the shock of pain when he grabbed her, the way time had frozen around her. She tried to stay strong, but her chest felt heavy. Her grandmother, a quiet woman with silver hair and kind eyes, placed a cup of tea on the table and said softly, "Baby, you don't have to carry all this alone. We'll do this right. We'll tell the truth." The girl nodded, but she didn't speak. She looked out the window instead, watching the morning sunlight fall across the street. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear church bells ringing. Meanwhile, at the police station, the officer who had caused the trouble was sitting at his desk, pretending nothing had happened. His partner walked by, uneasy but silent. Everyone in the room had heard rumors, but nobody wanted to be the one to ask questions. Then the chief of police walked in. His tone was calm, but his face looked serious. He called the officer into his office and shut the door behind them. "I got a call this morning," the chief began. "It's about what happened yesterday. You know what I'm talking about?" The officer crossed his arms. "She was being difficult," he muttered. "Wouldn't follow instructions. I did what I had to do." The chief looked at him for a long moment. "She's a kid," he said quietly, "and she had a broken arm." The officer shifted uncomfortably but didn't answer. The chief continued, "You need to understand. This isn't going away. Someone important saw what happened. I don't know who yet, but it's been brought to the mayor's attention." At that, the officer froze. "The mayor?" he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," the chief said, "and I've got a meeting in 2 hours to discuss it." Back across town, the mayor sat in his office reading over the early reports. He had been there only a few feet away when the incident happened. At first, he hadn't said anything because he wanted to see how the department would handle it. But now, hearing how the story was twisting and being covered up, he knew he couldn't stay silent much longer. He remembered the moment clearly, the sharp sound of the officer's hand, the way the girl had stumbled, and the disbelief on the faces of the people nearby. The mayor wasn't just angry. He was disappointed. The town had been trying to rebuild trust between the community and the police, and now, with one thoughtless act, all that progress was slipping away. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about calling the girl's family directly, but he also wanted to make sure the investigation was done right. He couldn't just act out of emotion. Meanwhile, the girl's grandmother received a call from someone she didn't expect, a reporter. Word had reached the local news station, and they wanted to hear her side of the story. The grandmother hesitated. She didn't trust the media. She knew how stories could get twisted, how people could turn something painful into a spectacle, but at the same time she knew staying quiet meant the truth might never come out. After a long pause, she said softly, "We'll talk, but we'll do it our way." That afternoon, the mayor arrived at the police station. Everyone straightened up as he walked in. The chief greeted him and led him to a private office. The officer who had caused the trouble sat in the corner looking tense. The mayor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness carried more weight than anger ever could. "I saw what happened," he said simply. "I saw the whole thing." The officer swallowed hard. "Sir, she wasn't listening," he began. The mayor held up his hand. "Stop." His voice was firm but steady. "You don't talk over me. Not right now." There was silence for a moment. The mayor leaned forward and said, "That girl did nothing wrong. She was hurt, scared, and you made it worse. That's not protecting the community, and that's destroying it." The officer didn't know what to say. His hands trembled slightly as he looked down at the floor. The mayor turned to the chief. "You need to take this seriously," he said. "I want a full review. Body cam footage, witness statements, everything. No cover-ups. No excuses." "Yes, sir," the chief replied quietly. After the mayor left, the station felt heavy with silence. The officer sat there for a long time, staring at the desk, realizing that his actions had reached far beyond that one moment. He wasn't just facing the mayor's anger. He was facing the judgment of an entire town. That evening, the girl's grandmother helped her sit down on the couch. The news had already started talking about it. A small headline ran on the screen. Local police under investigation after incident with injured teen. The girl looked at the TV but didn't say anything. Her grandmother placed her hand on the girl's shoulder and whispered, "You didn't do anything wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel small." The girl finally looked up and nodded. There was a quiet strength in her eyes, the kind that comes from knowing the truth will eventually be seen. Across town, the mayor sat at his desk late into the night. He drafted a statement, not a polished political one, but an honest message. He wanted the people to know that he had seen what happened, that he wouldn't ignore it, and that he believed in fairness for everyone. As he wrote, he thought about the girl, how young she was, how scared she must have been, and how easily things could have turned out worse. That thought alone kept him focused. The next morning, when the statement was released, the town reacted. Some people were shocked that the mayor had spoken so openly. Others felt relieved that someone was finally taking responsibility. The story began spreading beyond the town, reaching nearby cities and even national attention. The police department was now under a microscope. Reporters stood outside the building asking questions. The officer stayed home, suspended until the investigation was complete. He sat by the window staring out at the empty street, thinking about everything that had happened. At the same time, the girl's grandmother was preparing to meet the mayor in person. She wasn't sure what she'd say, but she wanted him to see her granddaughter not as a victim, but as a person, someone who deserved respect and understanding. When the mayor finally met them later that day, he greeted them with warmth and humility. "I'm so sorry for what happened," he said. "No one in this town should ever be treated like that." The girl looked up at him quietly and said, "I just want it to mean something. I don't want anyone else to go through it." The mayor nodded. "It will," he promised. "I'll make sure it does." That conversation became the start of something bigger. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about the need for change, and real change, in how people were treated, seen and respected. And though the pain of that day would never fully fade, the courage of one young girl, the support of her grandmother, and the conscience of a watching mayor began to move an entire community toward something better. "I said hurry up," he interrupted, stepping closer. From across the street, a man sitting outside a small cafe lifted his head. He had been reading something on his tablet, but the raised voices caught his attention. He recognized the officer, a local cop he'd seen around town. But it was the girl's nervous tone that made him look closer. He watched as she fumbled with her wallet, her movements slow and painful. The officer's shadow fell over her. "Stop playing games," he said, frustration rising. "I'm not, I promise," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It just hurts to move my arm fast." She finally managed to pull her ID halfway out when the strap of her bag slipped again. Instinctively, she reached up to adjust it. To the officer, it looked like she was hiding something. "Don't move your hand," he barked suddenly. Startled, she froze. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just fixing my bag." The officer's face tightened. "You don't make sudden moves when an officer's talking to you." She nodded quickly, her breath shaky. "Yes, sir." The man at the cafe watched closely. His jaw tightened. He didn't like where this was going. He knew that tone, not of authority but of assumption. He put down his tablet, his eyes fixed on the scene. The officer crossed his arms. "What's in the bag?" "Medicine," she said quietly. "From the pharmacy. For pain." He held out his hand. "Let me see it," she hesitated. Not because she didn't want to, but because her bag was hanging awkwardly under her sling. To hand it over, she'd have to shift her injured arm slightly, and she knew it would hurt. The officer misread the hesitation again. "What's the problem?" "Hand it over." It's hard to—" Before she could finish, he reached forward and grabbed the strap himself. The sudden movement startled her, and she stepped back. "Please be careful," she said softly. "My arm," but the officer wasn't listening. He yanked the bag open, pulling out the small paper bag from the pharmacy. He saw a bottle of painkillers, a receipt, and nothing else. For a split second, there was silence. Then he said, "You could have just told me that from the start." "I did," she whispered. The wind blew a few leaves past their feet. The moment should have ended there, but the officer wasn't satisfied. His pride had been touched, and he felt the need to reassert control. "Next time you're stopped, you answer quicker," he said harshly. "You don't make excuses." The girl's eyes filled with tears she didn't want to show. She nodded quietly. Yes, sir. Across the street, the mayor, stood up slowly. He didn't make a scene. He just watched. Every movement, every word, the officer took a step back. You can go, he said finally. She nodded again and started to walk away, her steps shaky. Her good hand gripped her bag tightly, the sling swaying slightly against her chest. She didn't look back. But just as she reached the corner, the officer called out, "Hey!" She turned, startled. "You better not pull something like that again," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You're lucky I didn't." He stopped himself mid-sentence, realizing his words were echoing down the street. The girl lowered her head, murmured another, "I'm sorry," and kept walking. The mayor's eyes followed her until she disappeared around the block. Then he turned his gaze back to the officer, who was now walking toward his car, shaking his head as if he'd just dealt with a nuisance. The mayor's expression was calm, but his mind wasn't. He took out his phone and checked the short video he had quietly recorded. The sound was clear enough. The image showed everything: the girl's sling, the officer's impatience, the imbalance of power. He didn't feel anger. He felt disappointment. This wasn't the kind of city he wanted to lead. The next morning, when he walked into his office, he didn't tell anyone what he had seen right away. He sat at his desk, replaying the video in silence. He saw the girl's frightened expression, her arm trembling as she tried to hold her bag steady. He saw the officer's hardened face, unmoved by her quiet pleas. He knew he couldn't stay silent. Not because it was political, but because it was human. That afternoon, he called the police chief into his office. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten anyone. He simply placed his phone on the desk and pressed play. When the short clip ended, the room was quiet. The police chief looked down at his hands, unsure what to say. The mayor finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and heavy with meaning. "Sometimes," he said, "it's not the crimes we commit that destroy trust. It's the way we treat people when we think no one's watching." The chief nodded slowly. "And this time," the mayor said, standing, "someone was."